الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ليس لك من الأمر شيء أو يتوب عليهم أو يعذبهم فإنهم ظالمون وقال الله تبارك وتعالى ولا تقولن لشيء إني فاعل ذلك غدا إلا أن يشاء الله صدق الله العظيم اللهم صل على سيدنا وحبيبنا وشفيعنا وسندنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا وحبيبنا وشفيعنا وسندنا ومولانا محمد مبارك وسلم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. In the Quran and in the Sunnah, the Hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allah Azza wa Jal is referred to in two different tenses, in two different ways. When we are taught His remembrance, words to remember Him by, sometimes He's referred to in the third person and sometimes in the second person. Huwa Allahu alladhi la ilaha illahu, third person. Allahu la ilaha illahu, Allah, there is no ilah except Him, third person. Shahid Allahu annahu la ilaha illahu, Qul huwa Allahu ahad, say He is Allah one, third person. And sometimes in the second person, Allahumma malik al-mulk, O Allah, King of the kingdom. Tu'til mulka man tasha, you give and grant the kingdom to whom you will. Wa tanzi'ul mulka mimman tasha, and you seize it, take it away from who you will. So in the second person, Allahumma, O Allah. Rabbana, our Lord. Again, Ya Rabbana, O our Lord. In the second person, Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, you alone we worship and from you alone we seek help, in the second person. Sometimes in the third person we refer to Allah as He, and sometimes in the second person as you. And it's as though this is a reflection of our own state, the human being. Sometimes we are thinking about Allah, and sometimes we are in front of Allah in terms of our own state. We are in the divine presence. And the point here is that divine presence never goes away in the heart of the believer. It's always there at the forefront of the mind, and sometimes at the time of preoccupation, perhaps not at the forefront of the mind, but ingrained in the mind. It's visceral, even in a person's sleep. So, in Surah Al-Alaq, Allah Ta'ala says, Alam ya'lam bi anna Allah yara. Does he not know that He is watching? Does the human being not know that Allah is watching him? In the Hadith of Jibreel, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam explains the status of ihsan, excellency in iman and faith. An ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tarahu, that you do ibadah, that you offer servitude, that you worship Allah as though you are seeing Him. So this is one-to-one in the divine presence. فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ تَرَاهُ فَإِنَّهُ يَرَاكَ, for if you are not seeing Him, then He is seeing you. The muhaddithin explain this to mean that there are two states of ihsan. One is in which it's as though you are seeing Allah, and the other is the one in which your heart isn't in a state in which it's as though you're seeing Allah, but you're conscious of Allah. You're conscious that He's seeing you, He's watching you. Now, let us take this to another level, and that is how this knowledge of the presence, the omniscience, the omnipotence, the presence of Allah Azza wa Jal, how this impacts on our understanding of affairs which happened to us and in us and around us and in the world. And this is signified through, for example, our clear understanding that nothing can happen without the will of Allah. And so tawakkul and reliance on Allah and dependence on Allah, in spite of or despite the apparent means which are taking things in one direction or another, the asbab, is integral to our faith to such a degree that in Surah Al-Fatiha, which is the quintessence of the meanings of the Quran, Iyaka nasta'een is a statement of tawakkul. From you alone we seek help in our deen, dunya and akhirah. So reliance on Allah, nasta'een, this isti'ana is tawakkul, it's reliance on Allah. That's how the ulama explain this. And so reliance on Allah is because we know ultimately that it's in His control. So this is one level of this effect. When you become aware of the Almighty, then you begin to rely upon Him. You realize that He is the one who controls all affairs. At the end of the day, in the end, ultimately, the outcome, the result, is a consequence of His decree and decision and not mine and yours. And this affects the way we talk as well, and the way we think as well. Or it should have this impact on the person who has Iman in his heart and proclaims the Shahada. And so we are taught, not once but repetitively in the Quran and Hadith, not even to commit to doing something without making an exception. Istithna, which is insha'Allah. And this is the sunnah of the Anbiya. Now how is this an exception? Let us explore. In Surah Noon wal qalami wa ma yasturun, Surah Al-Qalam, Allah Ta'ala says, وَلَا يَسْتَثْنُونَ. Allah Ta'ala is talking about the people of the orchard, the people of the garden, who were going to cut the crops, harvest the fruit, the crops the following morning, and they silently, secretly, discreetly conferred amongst themselves, and they said, in the morning, make sure that you get up early and go to cut the crops, and وَلَا يَدْخُلَنَّ عَلَيْكُمْ miskin. Let no miskin, no needy person enter upon you. Let people not come and take something away. We'll keep it all for ourselves. They made an intention not to give anything in charity. And they didn't say that we'll cut our crops in the morning, insha'Allah. وَلَا يَسْتَثْنُونَ. They didn't make the intention. And through the night a calamity befell the orchard. In the morning everything was wiped clean before the morning came. And they began to regret what they had done. Now why is this insha'Allah referred to as an exception? Let us dwell upon this. What does insha'Allah mean? Insha'Allah means if Allah wills. If Allah wills. And this is part of a much longer sentence. So if I say, I will come to the masjid tomorrow, what I should be saying is, I will come to the masjid tomorrow insha'Allah. I should be making the exception. How is this an exception? Because what this really means in Arabic is, I will come to the masjid tomorrow if Allah wills, ... What does the ellipsis, the ... stand for? I will come to the masjid tomorrow if Allah wills, and if He does not, then I will not come. That's the end bit which is implied every time you say inshallah. The opposite is implied. And that's the exception. So I will come to the masjid tomorrow if Allah wills, but the exception is, the caveat is, that if Allah does not will, then I will not come tomorrow, and I will not be able to. And this is part of our aqidah. So much so that it's mentioned in so many places in the Quran. Let us take some examples. In Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah Ta'ala mentions the event of Banu Israel. Why is Surah Baqarah called Surah Baqarah? Because Baqarah means cow or heifer, and Allah had instructed Banu Israel to sacrifice, to slaughter an animal of this sort, and to strike the dead man whose killer was unknown with part of this animal. He comes back to life and he speaks the name of his murderer, which happens to be his own heir, and he'd done this because he wanted to inherit the wealth of his uncle, and so he's deprived of this as a principle of law. If an heir to someone's estate becomes their murderer, they are deprived of the inheritance, and this is so there's no incentive for them to take this action. So when they were told to slaughter a cow, a heifer, they began to ask lots of questions. There's a whole section in Surah Baqarah. What colour should it be? What kind of animal should it be? And Musa is telling him, do as you're told, and just take an animal and slaughter it. And they're asking all these questions. So he asks Allah, they ask him to ask Allah, and Musa asks Allah, and Allah reveals to Musa Moses, and he tells them, and the detail comes. And the more the detail, the more the variables, the more difficult it becomes. Because if you ask for something simple, a biscuit is a biscuit. Can I have a biscuit? But if you say the biscuit must be made by this company, it must have chocolate chips inside it, and it must have no nuts inside it, the more specific you are, the more difficult it becomes to source the exact product that you're looking for. A glass of water is a glass of water, but if you want a glass bottle of mineral water from a certain company and a certain country, then it's more specific. It becomes more difficult to find the exact animal. You want to buy a pet, you want a cat, fine, let's get a cat, but it has to be this type of cat, it has to be a Siamese cat, it has to have this weight, it has to be this gender, it has to have this colour, its eyes must look like this. It becomes more difficult. So to source the animal becomes difficult. And the moral here is, when Allah Azza wa Jal asks you to do something, a simple instruction, don't make it complicated for yourself by asking. And the caveat is unnecessary questions. You can ask necessary questions, not unnecessary questions. Allah Azza wa Jal doesn't like excessive questioning where questioning isn't appropriate. Sometimes it's very obvious in this dunya as well. If you ask someone to do something and they start asking lots of questions, if but, it's an indication that they're not committed to fulfilling the order and instruction. So Banu Israel, eventually, when they're given the third set of instructions, they say, وَإِنَّا إِنْ شَاءَ قَالُوا الْآنَ جِئْتَ بِالْحَقِّ. Now you've brought something clear and true, meaning it can be fulfilled and it's clear, it makes sense to us. وَإِنَّا إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَمُهْتَدُونَ. And now, indeed, we will, if Allah wills, be guided to the animal of that description. And when they said insha'Allah, it happened, they found the animal, and the story continues. And it's mentioned in the hadith, had they not said insha'Allah, they wouldn't have found the animal. It's the barakat of insha'Allah. And then let's move on to the Anbiya alayhi salatu wassalam. Ibrahim alayhi salatu wassalam sees a dream in which he's slaughtering his son Ismail alayhi salam, and he asks his son, he says, what do you say? He mentions the dream, and the son says, Satajiduni insha'Allahu min as-sabirin. Insha'Allah, you'll find me from the patient. He says insha'Allah first here. It needs a lot of patience. Satajiduni insha'Allahu comes first, min as-sabirin. You'll find me, insha'Allah, if Allah wills, from the patient. And if Allah does not will, you won't. That's the implication. So he says insha'Allah. Musa alayhi salam is travelling with Khadir. You'll have read your Surah Kahf today. It's Jumu'ah. If you haven't, please do so. So in Surah Kahf as well, what happens? What happens is the Banu Israel, the Ahlul Kitab, come to Rasulullah and ask him a series of questions. And the Prophet says, I'll tell you tomorrow. But he doesn't on this occasion say insha'Allah. Allah Ta'ala, after a period of time, he reveals the answers, and he also reveals this verse, وَلَا تَقُولَنَّ لِشَيْءٍ. And do not say for anything, إِنِّي فَاعِلٌ ذَلِكَ غَدًا. I will do this tomorrow, إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ. Except that Allah wills. In other words, say, I will do this, I will do this tomorrow if Allah wills, and if Allah does not will, I will not do it tomorrow. So you can see all these examples, Banu Israel, Musa alayhi salam, Ismail alayhi salam, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and the moral in the people of the orchard who wanted to cut their crops in the morning. And of course the context in each one is different. And in the hadith, Ya'juj and Ma'juj, and the wall of Sikandar, shall I say, Dhul Qarnayn, not Sikandar, Dhul Qarnayn. There is an opinion that it's referring to Sikandar, but this isn't the strong opinion in tafsir. The Mufassirin have rejected this. Alexander the Great, this is not the Dhul Qarnayn of Surah Kahf. So Dhul Qarnayn, the wall he builds to blockade Ya'juj and Ma'juj. Now the hadith mentions that they will begin to eventually be able to open this wall when they say insha'Allah. What happens is they spend the whole night trying to make a hole in the wall. The Prophet mentioned Halaqa tis'in, they made a small hole. One morning the Prophet, one day he told the Sahaba, they made a hole this big. So what happens is they make a hole. So we don't know where that situation is now. There's a lot of theory going around there. Many people say they've already emerged, some people say they haven't. The bottom line is that this is not something to philosophize over. The clear mentioning in the Quran and Hadith cannot be interpreted in an indirect way. It must be taken as it is at face value. It's not some conceptual thing. When there's no dalil that is a metaphor, it must be taken on its literal meaning. So there are such people, and they will emerge when Allah wills. And the fact that we have satellite cameras, for example, doesn't mean at all that Allah Azza wa Jal cannot conceal a people, a community, if He so wills. So do they exist in this world? Have they emerged? If they exist and have not emerged, that's perfectly within Allah's qudra. But to move forward, they're also mentioned in the hadith. How we have time? 12. That before Qiyamah, when they eventually say inshallah, the hole will open up for them. So what is the moral for us? The moral for us, I began by talking about Allah Azza wa Jal's qudra and how Allah's decision and decree impacts everything that happens in this dunya, and how it as part of the ma'rifah of a mu'min, his recognition of Allah's greatness and power, and His Allah Ta'ala's omnipotence and His qudra and His taqween, His decisions, His irada. It's necessary for us to acknowledge always that what Allah wills is what will happen. And then this takes me to my next point, and I'll have to close with this in the time that we have this afternoon. And that is the point that we then have to be happy with Allah's decree as well. This is one of the morals in Surah Kahf, in the events which unfold when Musa Islam travels with Khadir. What we find is there's an unseen system at work in this dunya in which decisions are taken. Now, to give you an example, this is the changes in the weather, and the consequence of the changes in the weather are that changes happen on this physical earth. So for example, the amount of rain that falls and the change in the weather affects the crops. So is there a large produce or a small produce? The tree that was standing for 150 years is suddenly uprooted at a particular time. There's hikmah in everything. No leaf falls except without Allah's knowledge and permission. Nothing happens in this dunya by coincidence. So this whole balance of everything that happens, just as we see changes, for example, in the weather cycles, the number of deaths and births which happen in this dunya, even the change of governments, ultimately the control is in the hands of Allah. The apparent changes in the world are on one side of the spectrum. On the other side, Allah Azza wa Jal says, تُؤْتِي الْمُلْكَ مَنْ تَشَاءُ وَتَنْزِعُ الْمُلْكَ مِمَّنْ تَشَاءُ. Allah Ta'ala gives and takes governance from whom He wills. It's all in His control. So, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. The rise and fall of nations, all in the hands of Allah Azza wa Jal. So at any level, at the macro level, at the micro level, what changes happen in this dunya are a consequence of Allah's irada and decree, and He makes decisions for our dunya. And so ultimately, we must make dua for afiyah, for justice, for peace, for happiness, for health, for prosperity of human beings, Allah's creatures and creation, for ourselves and everybody else, wherever they may be. But the point is, ultimately, when something happens, we have to take that with rida. So there are two separate points, and this is subtle, and I'll just touch upon it. See, you don't want, for example, an elderly relative who's suffering from cancer or coronavirus or whatever it may be, you don't want them to pass away. We all make dua that they recover, or a younger person for that matter. So at this stage, you use the asbab and you rely on Allah and you take the medicines and you do what you need to do. But when that happens ultimately, and you have buried your own parent with your own hands, with reduced numbers and people not even being able to come and console you during your bereavement, this is the time for rida now. You have to understand the bigger picture, and you have to understand that what Allah willed did happen, and it might not have been the choice that you would have made, I would have made, but He made that choice, and as His servants it's our duty to accept that. So when we live our daily lives with this point in our minds, this point of everything that happens, ma sha Allahu kan wa ma lam yasha lam yakun, what Allah wills happens and what He doesn't. What He willed happened and what He didn't. When we keep this at the forefront of our minds and we accept this regarding ourselves and everybody else, it doesn't mean that we accept defeat in the face of circumstances and do nothing to better our situation, whatever it may be. You have to go to work, whatever it may be. You have to take medicine, you have to exercise. But the outcome ultimately is in Allah's hands, and we have to accept that, and we have to accept it without complaining. And that's one of the teachings of our iman. And so may Allah grant us tawfiq to hold on to these teachings. wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. बहुत इख्तिसार के साथ चंद जुमलों में आज के इस बयान का खुलासा ये है कि मुसलमान اس کا اقرار کرتا ہے کہ اللہ تعالیٰ کے فیصلے اٹل ہیں، ان کو انسان تبدیل نہیں کر سکتا، اللہ تعالیٰ جو ارادہ کرتا ہے اس کو پورا کرتا ہے۔ فعال لما یرید، جو چیز مقدر ہوتی ہے اللہ تعالیٰ کی طرف سے، قضاء و قدر کو ہم بدل نہیں سکتے، مگر توکل کا تقاضا یہ ہے کہ اسباب اختیار کیے جائیں، اور اس کا ہمیں حکم دیا گیا ہے، اور ہمیں اسباب اختیار کرنے ہیں، اللہ پر بھروسہ کرنا ہے، لیکن پھر جو نتائج نکلیں ان پر راضی رہنا ہے۔ اور اسی وجہ سے ہمیں یہ تعلیم دی گئی کہ ہر موقع پر جب کوئی ارادہ کرو تو انشاءاللہ کہو، تاکہ ہمیں یہ یاد رہے کہ اگر اللہ نے چاہا تو یہ کام ہوگا، اور اگر اللہ نے نہ چاہا تو نہیں ہوگا۔ اور یہ پورا جملہ، پورا مضمون مضمر ہوتا ہے۔ جب ہم کسی کام کا ارادہ کرتے ہیں اور یہ کہتے ہیں کہ کل میں یہ کام کروں گا انشاءاللہ، تو اس کا مطلب یہ ہوتا ہے کہ میں یہ کام کروں گا اگر اللہ نے چاہا، اور اگر اللہ نے نہ چاہا تو پھر میں نہیں کر سکوں گا۔ یہ پورا مضمون ہوتا ہے، یعنی اس کے آگے انشاءاللہ کے آگے ایک پورا مضمون ہوتا ہے، اور یہ ہمارے دل میں ہونا چاہیے۔ اور صرف اسی بات کا مراقبہ چلتے پھرتے اٹھتے بیٹھتے کہ جو اللہ کی مرضی۔ اب اس سے یہ ہمارے کوئی فرائض معاف نہیں ہو جاتے، ہماری ذمہ داریاں جو ہیں وہ ان سے چھٹی نہیں مل جاتی۔ ہم نے اسباب بھی اختیار کرنے ہیں، دینی دنیاوی، نماز بھی پڑھنی ہے، زکوٰۃ بھی دینی ہے، حج بھی کرنا ہے، روزے بھی رکھنے ہیں، اور حلال معاش کے لیے محنت بھی کرنی ہے، پسینہ اپنے ہاتھ کے پسینے سے کمانے کی کوشش بھی کرنی ہے، مگر ہاتھ کی محنت سے، اپنے پسینے سے، مگر اس سب کے ساتھ ساتھ یہ بات بھی یاد رکھنی ہے کہ بالآخر فیصلہ اللہ کے ہاتھ میں ہے، اور پھر جب ہماری منشا کے مطابق جو ہم چاہتے ہوں اس کے مطابق نتیجہ نہ نکلے تو اس پر راضی بھی رہنا ہے۔ اللہ والے اپنا ارادہ، اپنا منشا رکھتے ہی نہیں ہے، بلکہ اسی کا نام ہے قضا پر رضا بالقضاء، اللہ تعالیٰ کے فیصلے پر راضی رہنا، اور اس درجے میں راضی رہنا اپنی طرف سے کوئی معصیت نہ ہو، اس درجے میں راضی رہنا کہ کچھ ہو جائے، بڑی سی بڑی مصیبت آ جائے اپنی ذات سے متعلق یا انسانیت دنیا سے متعلق، تو ان حالات میں سورہ کہف فتنے کے دور میں اہتمام سے پڑھنی چاہیے، جمعہ پڑھنی چاہیے، روزانہ پڑھ سکیں روزانہ پڑھنی چاہیے۔ تو سورہ کہف کی تعلیمات میں سے بھی یہ ایک تعلیم ہے، انشاءاللہ کہنا، اور تکوینی، اللہ تعالیٰ کے تکوینی نظام کو تسلیم کرنا کہ اللہ تعالیٰ کے فیصلے ہر وقت ہمارے سمجھ میں نہیں آتے، لیکن اس میں خیر اور حکمت ہوتی ہے۔ تو یہ ہمارے ایمان کی حفاظت کا ایک مستقل وسیلہ ہے، ہر وقت اس بات پر نظر رکھنا کہ اللہ کی حکمتیں اللہ جانے، ضروری نہیں کہ ہم سمجھ سکیں، لیکن اس پر راضی رہنا ضروری ہے۔ اللہ تعالیٰ توفیق عطا فرمائے۔ وآخر دعوانا الحمدللہ رب العالمین۔